So today's mostly on like joint health and stability, kind of for the long haul. So how do we keep our joints functioning long into those kind of quote unquote retirement years, so we can have, more activities kind of at our leisure. So we can do stuff like rock climbing, play sports, that kind of stuff into our 80s, 90s, and maybe even longer. So to kick things off, we're going to have Dr. Dan run us through a little full body CARS routine.
I think we're going to do the upper portion only just for the sake of space and time, because I don't think we're going to get on the floor. Has anybody heard of CARS, controlled articular rotations? So CARS are popular because what they do is they take your joint through its full range of motion. And I call it like a Swiss Army knife because it lets you check in with your body every morning. So I use something called a morning routine, which takes you through the whole body in terms of this joint movement. It also gives you a good way, if you see somebody like myself, you can communicate with somebody like myself as you're going through a movement. If you feel a pinch or a stretch, you can mention it to me, and then I know exactly where to go with that as well. But one of the most important things for longevity is that it allows you to put nutrition. The most important thing for nutrition in your joints is not necessarily what you're eating and how you're hydrating, which is also important, but how you're moving that joint, okay? When you're squeezing that joint and cartilage, you're bringing nutrition in, you're pushing stuff out. So if everybody wants to stand, and then I'm going to walk you through a little bit of this. Currently, if anybody has any conditions that they're kind of concerned about, I want you to err on the caution side before you see someone or talk to somebody. So we're going to start with the neck area. Just a little highlight is we're going to something called irradiation, where we're going to tense up the rest of our body while we're moving one part of the body. And what that allows you to do, it lets you isolate that part of your body so you can focus on the part we're focusing on. I also want you to be aware when we're going on what we call an acute side or a short side. So if I'm taking my neck to one side and I feel a bit of a pinch, just back off that and kind of skip that segment, okay? So we're going to squeeze your arms in front of you, make a fist, squeeze. We're going to bring that chin to your chest. You're going to kind of roll the head around. We're going to come all the way around, come back. We're going to come back the other way, scrape the chest, your chin across your chest, and come back and roll around. So that's the neck area there. And we're just going to pause. Usually we do at least, 2 to 4 of those. Just for the sake of time today, I'm just going to kind of walk you through. We're going to keep this arm outstretched, and with your right arm now, I want you to bring your arm up overhead. You're going to feel kind of like a block sensation. Then you're going to, kind of like you're wringing out a towel, we're going to twist away. Just be careful, again. And then you're going to end up with your pinky ahead of you. Okay. And we're going to reverse that. We're going to slowly go back the other way. At this point, you're going to feel a block sensation at about 30 degrees. And then you're going to come bring that towel out again, and then we're going to twist and come through. We're going to switch the other side. We're going to come on up. This is specifically for the shoulder joint. We're going to rotate, come through, pinky to the front. And now we're going to come back, block sensation, wring that towel out again, and then we're going to come and thumb back up. Okay? Now just be careful for your partners. We're going to go about, it's not in the front of you, not in the side of you, about 45 degrees. This is for the scapula or the shoulder blade rolling around the ribs. So we're going to hike up the shoulders up towards your ears. We're going to roll them back towards your back pocket, and then slowly come forward. So imagine if I had a little dot right here, I'm making a circular movement with that. Okay, keep the elbow straight. So we're going to rotate. Now we're going to reverse directions, go the other way. Good. Now we're going to pause for a sec. You're going to keep your arms here. We're going to do the wrist area here. Imagine with the wrist, you're going to have like a cup or like an X or your favorite single malt for IPA sitting here, and you don't want it to tip over. So you're going to grab your wrist. You're going to rotate those fingers. And you're making a huge circle with those fingertips. Okay? And we're going to come all the way over. And back up. All right, grab the other wrist. Let's do the same thing. We're going to rotate through all the way. Nice and slow and controlled. So I failed to mention, but imagine you're going through almost like water or sand, like a nice, slow, controlled movement through that. Good. Now we're going to do the elbow. With the elbow, we're going to place one finger inside one elbow. We're going to come here. We're going to come on up. We're going to rotate that elbow. We're going to come down, palm back up, rotate, and we're going to come down and back up. Last one. We're going to go to the other side. Good. So we're going to come up, rotate, come down, rotate back, up, rotate. So I have a video of this. It's called the morning routine, and we have a little sign-up sheet. If you want the video of that, we can send that to you. Next, we're going to do a little bit of mid-back. This one, I want you to tighten up your butt cheeks a bit so you're nice and stable. And we're going to roll. So you're going to roll the spine forward, and then we're going to bring the spine to the side. And then what you want to do is not hyperextend your spine. That's why you want to tighten up your butt. And you want to kind of roll that spine through, And this is more of a spinal range of motion as well. Good. I think we'll just do that for now. Just give you a little exercise. You can have a seat, and we'll get started. Thank you.
Cool. Hope everybody's feeling nice and supple and awake. So a quick overview on what's going on today. So we're going to talk through just aging versus anti-aging at a glance. So traditionally we think like age is just kind of something that just happens. There's not a whole lot we can do about it. There's tons of research and tons of like applied data that we found actually that shows the opposite. So there's tons that we can do to keep ourselves functioning like a younger human into our more mature years, we'll call them. So we'll talk through an overview of functioning younger as we age, kind of the template that we use for that, the variables we can kind of optimize when we think about functional fitness and health. We'll talk about optimizing long-term joint function. That's really the scope of today. The joints aren't working well. Nothing else is going to work well because we need movement. And we'll talk through the like a little bit of movement correction. So functional movement should be your kind of core, your bread and butter of what you're doing for your movement kind of routine, your exercise, your fitness, if you will. And then we'll kind of finish with some applied stuff. So a little bit of practical stuff on how we strategize for kind of long-term health for your joints as we get kind of in those mature years. So first of all, first thing we have to think about is where does this information come from? So we kind of start with the academic literature is where we kind of use our basis for how formulating our own kind of practical strategies. And this is not perfect information, but it is information we can kind of use and apply to ourselves. So it kind of starts with like animal studies. So it might start with like mice, rats, kind of into larger animals, into something that's closer genetically to humans. There might be in vitro testing. So taking a small slice of a realistic thing might be a cadaveric study, something that looks at some tissue that's like in isolation, look at relationships that way. We can look at statistics, epidemiology, so populations, what's happening in the blue zones, the populations where people are living older. What are things that they might be doing right that we can kind of apply to ourselves? And then case studies. And that's kind of where the world of biohacking comes in. That's sort of a buzzword that I think that's getting on some people's nerves to hear that word. But it basically, all that means is we're kind of like using a bit of the literature and basically applying that to ourselves and testing a little bit on ourselves. Because even if the epidemiology tells us something works, it doesn't mean it's going to work for each individual. So this gives us a way to kind of get a practical template that works for us in practicality. So before we get into the kind of the mechanics and the joint stuff, I just want to kind of run through this slide because I think this is really, this was profound when I first learned this. So there's a study by Holt and Lundstedt in 2010, and this was a statistical study, so they didn't look at like individual stuff or causation. It was basically just correlation. But what they found, they analyzed all these different factors in different populations that tended to live longer, and they found that the common themes, the most critical factors that was related to people living longer was social support and social integration. And the way they defined those was like social support is like the people that are closest to you, your family, your close friends, your relatives, those type of people. And social integration was actually slightly higher. And this is how we interact with like less people we're less familiar with. So acquaintances, strangers, kind of how you talk to that person that works at the coffee shop. Are we polite? Do we have those good interactions with those people? That's actually what is the number one factor that keeps people living healthy for longer. And again, this is just epidemiology, but I thought that was kind of cool. We can use this information for ourselves. So generally, stuff like this, socializing, seeing people is good for us. So what does aging look like? So these are the things that tend to decline as we age, as you guys are mostly aware of. So loss of mobility, that could be anything from losing range of motion in your joints to like not being able to get on and off the toilet. So losing those kind of independence things as we get a longer age. Loss of cardiovascular fitness, that's still the number one killer, is heart attack. So that's something we want to maintain as we get older as well. Loss of functional strength. There's been really, really fascinating data that's looked at the relationship of strength and mortality. So we found that strength was in a huge study in 2017. It's been repeated in a few other studies, epidemiology, and we're still trying to figure out the hows and the whys of why this is. But basically, they looked at huge populations and they found that the stronger people's grip strength was in longer years, the longer they lived. And I think one of the sort of theories on that is that falls become so critical. And when you fall, you get injured, you get less active. But we're still kind of figuring that out. Anyways, functional strength is super important. So hopefully you guys, the take home today is we should be doing some kind of resistance training, some kind of strength training to keep ourselves stronger as we get longer into those years. And then we have kind of the aesthetic stuff. So loss of skin elasticity, we get wrinkles in our face, we get loss of graying of hair, and there's things that we can actually do there. And cognitive decline. And that's actually, again, highly related to what we're doing physically. So the brain and the body have this connection. So these are things that we want to like consider when we think about how do we create a model for kind of anti-aging practices. So one of the things we can use for that is functional age. And the definition of functional age is how well we're performing compared to our peers. So if, for example, we actually created a test for this. So I measured at a functional age of 23, so meaning that my physical function is equivalent to like a 23-year-old. And the bigger the gap we can have between our actual age and our functional age, theoretically, the better we should be functioning as we get into our older years. So we can't like predict specifically how long we're going to live, but this is kind of a metric we can use. And basically it comes down to physical activity, how well our mobility, our strength, our cardio, our cognitive function, all those things are relative to our peers. So it gives us a measure. That's kind of helpful as we assess how we're doing. And these are kind of the variables we look at. So again, those things that kind of decline, our mobility, that's the big focus in today. So not just our flexibility and how much range of motion we have in our joints, but the stability and the range and control we have of our joints is really, really critical. That's going to be our focus on today. Cardiovascular fitness is really important. I think that's traditionally a little bit overblown in how that's proportional. Everyone thinks that cardiovascular heart attack and stuff, we got to work on our heart and cardio, but it is important, but it's not just as important as we once thought it was in terms, especially compared to functional strength. That's like the number one take home, I think, from today is we need to keep ourselves strong as we get older. And then functional strength, again, we talked about that. That is super, super important. Body composition, you look at populations that are obese definitely don't live as long. So we know that's super important. That's kind of the extremes. There is kind of a healthy range of body composition that we want to maintain. So these are things we want to keep in consideration. Then cognition. So basically how well is our brain functioning as we get in those later years. And the older we live, just a note on that, like our body, we're probably going to see that become more of like an epidemic problem, is that our bodies are functioning longer and our brains are tending to decline, we are seeing a rise in like dementia and that kind of stuff and like cognitive disease. So that's something we do want to take care of from an early age as possible, because they've actually found signs of cognitive decline starting as early as 30. So most of us in the room are probably past that already. So we want to start thinking about how do we maintain that for as long as possible. So the base principle for how we start to strategize fighting this aging thing is a principle called hormesis. So that's basically little moderate amounts of stress. So if we have too much stress, we have a problem. If we have too little stress, that's also a problem. So the happy point is somewhere in the middle. So the base principle is if you have no stress, you have like no recovery to that. So you have no adaptive response to that. And you actually can speed the aging process if we're not stimulating ourselves enough with enough stress to maintain youth. At the other extreme, if we go too high on the stress, our body can't recover enough, so we have inefficient adaptations, and that actually speeds up the aging process as well. So we want to find in every kind of category of physical ability, we want to find that happy median. So that moderate amount of stress, that we get that moderate amount, then we get an optimal recovery, we get optimal adaptation, and that actually can sometimes reverse the principle of aging. So that's going to lead us into mobility. So again, the body movement we know is super, super important. That is something that's pretty clear from if we look at the blue zone data. The populations that live longer are just more active. That doesn't mean they're like running marathons or like lifting crazy weight, but they're more active than the other populations. And to be active, we need our joints to be healthy. So that's kind of the main focus in today. So our strategies on resolving and preventing joint pain. So basically when we don't have this stuff, we can lose strength actually, when we lose mobility. This can lead from stuff like shoulder impingement. If we're not spending a lot of time overhead and all of a sudden we go over there, your body can kind of freak out and we can lead to other problems. It can lead to muscle tears. If we're kind of at end range, your body's not used to getting there. So sensitive kind of becomes this a vulnerable position. So we want to be strong in these vulnerable positions. And we also want to be able to like avoid joint pain. That's the obvious thing. Low back pain, kind of knee pain. If that kind of stuff is lingering, that's going to, again, spike our activity level down and end up being problems for us later on. So on the flip side, benefits of improving our mobility or optimizing our joint function, we get improved mental health. We get faster recovery. We reverse joint pain, a longer health span, so we live longer. We reduce chance of injury. Basically, when we have controlled range of motion across our whole joints, our joints are more stable and more resilient towards external forces or stuff that might cause an injury. And then improve sleep as well. So there's ton of benefits, no real bad sides. If you're not doing stuff for mobility, it's never too late to start. That's the take home from today. In terms of how to start from this, you don't need a ton. This is actually a longer list than you probably need. But in terms of equipment, a lacrosse ball, which is about $3, compression wrap, which is about $10, a foam roller you can get for about $30, and then a heavy resistance band, maybe $40. So nothing on the list is more than $40, and this can like add years to your life. It's worth its weight in gold. And we'll talk through some of the exercises and how we start to use these things as well. So the strategy that we've come up with for how to optimize mobility, this is basically a template. So when most people are like stiff or struggling with their mobility, the first thing they go to is like stretching. It's not necessarily wrong, but if we look at things more holistically, there could be something that we're not addressing if we're just stretching. So this is kind of our holistic way of assessing how our joints function. And there's a few things that can be restricting movement. So the first thing we look at is what are the tense muscles around the joint of interest. So if we think of the shoulder, the big muscle, the meaty muscles around the shoulder are your pec and your lats. So if you've got restriction in your shoulder, whether that's overhead, maybe it's external rotation, maybe it's internal rotation, the first thing we want to look at are what are the big muscles, or specifically, what are the muscles that actually are used for that movement, that rotation. But if we don't know that, we're not super abreast on our anatomy, we should just start with the big meaty muscles. Look for tension where there could be tension, and then kind of there's a bit of an iterative process, but that's sort of how we do that. The next thing we look at is opening the joints. So basically, joint space can actually get restricted. So if we think through the shoulder, you could actually get like your joints, just kind of friction in the joint. And if we're not getting it lubricated, we're not getting the right movement there, the joint just might not move well. So if we open that joint up, just reverse a bit of gravity, we can start to restore a bit of movement that way. And then the next step is lengthening. So if we address the tension in the tissues, we've addressed the compression in the joint, the next thing is the muscles themselves actually short. So that's where we can resolve things with stretching. So this could be passive stretching, could be active stretching, could be dynamic stretching. All forms have different benefits. It depends really the environment we're doing that in. But basically that's the next step in the chain here. And the next thing we look at is alignment. This is where it's great to have a great chiropractor. So sometimes your joints might have good joint tension. There might be a little tension. There might be a little compression in the joint. You might even be flexible in the muscles. But if it's not aligned properly, then it's not going to move in the right direction, and that can lead to problems. So having a chiropractor, or sometimes there's self-corrective stuff when we do with muscle activation that can help with alignment. But that's the next step in the process. And the last piece of it is activate. And this is probably the piece that most people are missing most commonly. So the drill that Dan did at the top there is like what we call active kind of mobility work. So basically you're using your musculature to work through the end ranges of your joints. If we can do that kind of stuff daily, we're not only getting flexible, but we're also basically gripping control of our joints across the entire range of motion. That's when we can get more resilient towards those injuries and basically have more activities available to us because we can control that entire range. So that's kind of the template that we work with. This is how we build our mobility programs. You don't always need to address all of these, but when we think from a starting point and assessing each of these pieces, that gives us the best chance of reaching the solution. And it is a little bit iterative. Sometimes you are going to benefit better from stretching, sometimes release, massage, that kind of stuff. It depends what's going on, and it's pretty multifactorial. You kind of need to be a physio or a chiropractor or a mad scientist sometimes to figure out what the real issues are. But a bit of trial and error is how we do that. And then retest of, whatever the restriction is. If you're looking for overhead range, you do a movement exercise. Does your overhead range improve? Is it less painful? We call that a win, and we keep that exercise in kind of the pot. So we're going to kind of segue into strength. So once the joints are kind of functional, the base principle of strength training is we need to struggle. Strength does not come without some form of struggle, and I think that comes from we want good technique and practice. Comes from a confidence in your abilities to do the movements. But if we're not actually struggling through the range that we're working, we're not going to build functional strength efficiently. So why strength matters? We talked through the kind of the link towards morbidity. We know that strength peaks between 20 and 30, and then it tends to decline after there if we're not careful. And this isn't ubiquitous. This isn't like unavoidable, but this is statistically what happens to populations as we get older. So from 30 to 50, strength decreases by 60 to 40%. And again, we can do a lot about that, but if we don't do anything, that's what we're looking at. In the later years, strength decreases by an average of 1.5 per year, up to 70, and then 3% per year thereafter. And again, there's tons we can do if we're like diligent with our strength and fitness protocol, but that's kind of what we're looking at. And that's, again, where grip strength, if we don't have like that strength as we get into our older years and you slip and fall and you literally can't bring yourself off the ground, that can be catastrophic. And it can lead to other issues, right? If that just decreases our activity, then your cardiovascular fitness shoots down. You have other joint kind of problems as compensating for that kind of stuff. So that's kind of why we prioritize strength. The hows and the whys of strength starts with good form. And the first rule that we apply to our functional stuff is neutral spine. Neutral spine, we think like what you probably have heard before is like straight back. There's no such thing as a straight back. That's as straight as your back gets. It has natural curve in your cervical spine, in your thoracic spine, and your lumbar. We want to maintain those natural curves as best we can, especially when we're lifting heavy. And especially if it's like hinging, we got some kind of like unnatural load through that spine, especially if it's being loaded axially. So that's kind of what we want to maintain. The next thing is, how do we keep that with movement? And the kind of steps we use for that is we use the law of torque, and we use the diaphragmatic breathing. So the law of torque says if we corkscrew with our hips, that's going to help us lock in our neutral spine and the lower spine. If we use the law of torque in terms of corkscrewing our shoulders, that's going to lock in our upper thoracic spine, and the breath helps us lock in that kind of lower thoracic spine, that deep diaphragmatic breath. So if you've studied music or done yoga, imagine blowing air into your belly. That's kind of the motion we want. And that, if we have those 3 steps locked in before we do any kind of functional movement, it's going to astronomically improve our chances of doing the movement safely and getting the most benefit from it. We want it to be load appropriate. And again, the results don't come without struggle, and they don't come with bad form. So you want to find that happy medium where we can use as much weight as possible, where we're not compromising form. And there shouldn't be pain while we're doing it. That's our other kind of side note rule with that. And they also want to be balanced. And this is, I think, most people left their own devices making their own program. And I kind of go back to the 20-something meatheads that I used to be earlier in life. Is the every day's bench press and triceps, and you never do any kind of rows, and all of a sudden you're wondering why your pecs are pulling you forward and you can't get your arms overhead. Well, we want that balance, and basically that's just kind of good practice. So for every kind of set that we do as a push, we want to do minimum amount in a pull as well, so our joints are just kind of more well balanced. And same goes upper body, lower body. And then rest and recovery. So the template that we know that works best. We try to take our information from who's doing this best in the world and then be able to scale that down to what's going to make most sense to us. So if we study like the strongest people in the world, powerlifters, strongmen, we know what's worked traditionally is X amount of reps over X amount of sets with programmed rest in between. And that rest is really important. That gives our joints time to recover. It gives basically time in between sessions to recover from one day to the next. It's really important. And again, we don't need to be as strong as the freaks of nature in the world, but we know it's efficient, we know it's safe, so we're going to follow that method and as efficient as possible. So base programming, this is going to segue into the stuff Dan's talking about. So when we think about strength training and functional stuff, there are no better movements to start with than these. So squatting. Basically, our ancestors couldn't go to the bathroom without squatting. So that's something that's very natural movement. If we have that in our toolbox, it opens up a whole list of functionality, kind of especially when we get into later years. The deadlift, so pulling. We don't have to deadlift crazy heavy as we get into later years, but if you can't deadlift at all, you're not going to be able to pick your groceries up off the floor. These are some things we need to start thinking about early, right? So general pulling strength with bracing our core with good form. Pressing, bench press. Again, we think like the 90-year-old that falls. If you can't do a push-up off the floor, some version of that, a scaled version of a push-up, you can be stuck on the floor, right? So that's kind of where we kind of scale that from. And then some kind of upper body pull. And that could be a pull-up. It could be a ring row. If a pull-up is not even close to your arsenal, there's ways to scale that movement. But basically a vertical pull or a horizontal pulling movement, that's kind of your core four of how we kind of build programs and give you guys the best chance of being strong for as long as possible. And I'll pass it over to Dan to start talking about some joint-by-joint concepts.
So one of the things based on what Craig talked as well is if you think of your last, we call that the marginal decade, which is kind of the last 10 years of your life, whatever that means. Some people want to live forever and some people are okay not doing that. And the concept of health span, so you want to live healthy for as long as possible as opposed to living long years. So this is where we get into this idea of thinking of the 10 activities that you might want to do in that last decade and what it would take to do those activities. And so one of the most important, I'm going to spend quite a bit of time focusing on the squat because like we said, if you got to get off the toilet, if you got to get off the ground, the squat is one of the most important ones that we talk about. So when we get into a squat, as our ancestors once did, we used to take our butt right to the grass all the way down and kind of hold that position. In order to get into that position though, there are some requirements that we need. And taken from a joint by joint process, the mid back, which is the thoracic spine, I'll start at the top. We need a bit of mobility in there. Naturally, we're stiff because we have to protect these very vital organs that sit inside of there. But with our modern life posture that we're carrying, most of us get really, really stiff in our shoulders and our thoracic spine. So having some programming to kind of keep some mobility in that thoracic spine is very important to actually get into a squat position. You'll see a lot of people, if they're squatting with any sort of weight, they're kind of hunching forward into this position. And that could be part of the thoracic spine. The L spine, the lumbar spine, which is your low back, which is kind of this region. Thanks. In here, kind of what Greg was talking about, creating that neutral spine. So essentially, we don't want to lose that curve in the low back. But what happens is when we don't have mobility in other areas, we start using that low back to lift and to move. And we actually want that to stay fairly rigid. And we use that diaphragmatic breath, which is essentially, we're going to review it in a second, but a little later on. But essentially, if you put your fingertips kind of right in your abdomen, if everybody wants to try that, and you just push it out, and then you just take little sips of air while you're pushing it out, and you try to maintain that. And that's kind of how you create that rigid spine as well. We'll come back to that point in a second. Then as a result of having stiff hips, which most people, we should be moving with a stable neutral spine, and we should move around the hips. And that's essentially what we're going to review a hinge as well. But when we hinge, what we're doing is we're keeping the lumbar spine, the low back nice and stable, and we're moving around the hips. And if we do that, it's pretty hard to get hurt in the low back. But because we don't have good hip mobility because we sit a lot, we end up with stiff hips, and we end up moving at the spine instead of moving at the hip, okay? And then the knee should be stable as well. You'll see a lot of, we'll review a little bit of this, but you'll see a lot of this caving in of the knees. The knees should be right over the toes, and that's when we corkscrew that foot in. That's what we're doing. We're rotating those knees out so that we're nice and stable, and the knee is stable, and it doesn't kind of cave in. As a result of, and then the mobile hip, and then the mobile ankle as well. So you'll see that the joint above and below is always kind of affected. So if we don't have mobility in one joint, we end up hurting the other one. So that you'll often see the knees and the low back are the ones that take a beating if we don't have good mobility in the joints. So the ankles need a bit of mobility, and we're going to do this little 5-inch test that I got a little bit of tape around that if we get a sec, we might get an opportunity to do that. But that tells us if you have enough mobility in your ankle to actually get into a squat position. Because what you see usually when people have stiff ankles is that they come down, then the ankle stops, and then they start doing this with their upper back. And so that's pretty common to see as well. And then we also need a stable foot, and I'll talk about this tripod foot, which is essentially your heel, your big toe, and your pinky should be in contact with the floor. So even when you do corkscrew, you don't want to bring your foot off, or you don't want to collapse in as well. We're good? So the hip screen, what are you thinking about moving around? Do you think we're able to? Do you think too much, or what should we go through?
This then?
Yeah, I don't think we can get everybody lying on their back, but
Should get a volunteer.
if you want to do a volunteer, can I get a volunteer? Anyone? Here it comes. Okay. All right. So what we're gonna do? Let me just do we'll do it on the bench right here. Let me do a quick demo. Upside to you have it here, off here, and grab your knee in and come back down. Can't do this. And essentially, just let's see what happens, and then we'll talk to it. And grab that knee, roll back. So a couple things we want to look at. So there's going to be pass-fail on a couple of these. So one is, do you get a pinch in the front of your hip? Yeah. So if we can't bring that knee up towards the chest, so let's act like you can't do that. So a couple things can happen. So, I can't bring it because I got a blocked sensation in the front of my hip. That tells us something. If it's because it's tight in the back, that tells us something else. If it's a block in the front, it's usually the hip joint itself is stiff. If it's tight in the back, it's usually because you sit a lot and your glutes are super tight and your hamstrings are super tight as well. Okay? So let's pull that again. And then we also look at what happens to this leg. Okay, so just for simplicity, I'm just going to talk. So let's straighten that out. So some people will bring this up, or they'll do this. So that tells us the hip flexors, which are the muscles on the front, are too tight, or this quad's too tight. Okay, so based on how you do on this Thomas test, we have workarounds. We can either work on the hip, or we can work on the soft tissue as well. You're good? Yeah. Okay, good job. She passed. So again, if we lack this adequate mobility that we talked about, so if you don't have that hip mobility, usually your knees are going to start losing a bit of stability, and they're going to start caving in. And then if they cave in, we can hurt all the ligaments, and in between the bones, we have meniscus, cartilage in there, and that's usually when we get cartilage tears or strains in that area. The low back, so if we don't have that mobility in the hip as well, like I said earlier, you're going to come here, and then you're going to end up rounding your back and use your back, which is absolutely not what your back was not designed to lift anything. It's a stability part of the spine that kind of transfers weight over, and that's why we have the biggest muscle in the body is the glute max. So that's what you want to, when you hinge back, what you're doing is you're creating tension, so those muscles do all the work as well. And then of course, if you don't have mobility, that reduces power and increases your risk of injury as well. So if you want to perform better, that's why it's important to get that mobility in the hip as well. I could later, I want to give you a little specifics to work on as well. So just for the sake of time, we'll just keep it moving forward. So if it's a restriction, it could either be, again, the soft tissue in the back, or it could be actually the joint in the front. So just to remind you, if you don't know a little bit of the anatomy, the hip joint is a ball and socket joint. We're going to come back to this because we're going to talk about your positioning of your squat position and how that's impacted by your personal anatomy. We're good. So this is some pass-fail stuff that we just talked about as well. And this is called the Thomas test. So essentially we're looking for where that knee is going. So just to do a little recap, if we can't get the knee up because we got a pinch in the front, that's a hip joint that's blocked. And there's workarounds for that. Typically heavy banded work that we talked about, placing a band, putting it on a rig, putting it on a pole at home, placing that band and pulling the hip joint so that the actual hip joint comes back. That's one of the best strategies to get in terms of the joint itself. If it's a soft tissue, that's where we get into foam rolling, lacrosse balls, stretching, that type of thing as well. Oh, one of the things, let me just bring this one point back, just for those of you that do lifting. So one of the issues when we have this pinch in the front is if you're working incorrectly with your anatomy, let's say, for example, based on what we're going to talk about in a sec, you should be a little wider, or you should actually externally rotate your toes a little bit, and you just keep squatting plus with weight, and you keep feeling a pinch in the front of the hip, and you keep going through that, you're essentially damaging the joint over time, and that actually will give you that part of that block sensation will be part of that, because it's actually inflamed or irritated as well, the joint. Okay, so that's why it's important to squat with your anatomy as well. I think so. Again, too much sitting is usually the soft tissue stuff, or even you're not squatting enough. So just like you do the cars, you do all these controlled articular rotations. I've had patients that are 85 years old that can just hang out in a squat, for half an hour, no problem. Some cultures, they wait for the bus for that time. So the more you do a certain technique, the more you're going to get through that motion as well. One of the soft tissue techniques that we use is to actually sit for the ankle and the hips, is that actually sit with the weight in that position, shifting over the ankle, shifting over the hips, and getting that soft tissue to actually stretch under load as well. So a couple stretches to consider. World's greatest 90-90s, which are rotating. If you have any questions later, we can answer what these are. The half kneeling hip flexor stretch, deep goblet squat. The big one that I like to remind as well is to squat with your hips and not with your knees. So that encourages you when you're coming up to actually pull up and bring those knees out and focus on your glutes when you're active in that motion. That will help you activate the glutes. So a little bit of the hip anatomy and the squat. So the hip itself that hip joint should come at about a 40, an angle out to the side. What we've learned over the years is that some people, their actual hip joint almost comes right in the front, or it actually comes in the back. So based on one of the tests that we have, so based on the position of your femur, or based on where the socket actually is located in your anatomy, there's people that are on two extremes of the other one. So some people that have it towards the front, they actually benefit, and then these people will probably know that they're a little pigeon-toed. So these people actually benefit from a narrower stance and having their toes kind of facing forward. Most people will benefit from a slight, say 5 to 7 degree rotated out and about shoulder width apart. If your socket's in the back, that won't satisfy either. You're going to have a much wider stance, and your feet are actually going to turn out quite a bit. So there's a couple tests that we can do for that. Let me see if I got those teed up. So this is where I say when you should actually screen your hip, don't force it. If it doesn't feel right as well, you should probably talk to somebody about that knows what they're talking about. And this is a term called anteversion versus retroversion. So all of you can try this. So we're going to try, as you're seated there, so you're going to try to just bring that knee up, even if you grab it with the thigh of the other one, and you try turning your leg in, and you try turning your leg out. So if you have lots of what we call internal rotation and a little bit of external rotation, that's rare. But if you have that, you're the one that benefits more from a narrower stance. If you have the opposite, if you have like no internal rotation and you have a lot of external rotation, I have more of that. I benefit from being a little bit wider, and I benefit from having my toes a little bit more externally rotated. Also, when I have a patient on the table, I'll take their knee up, and if I take them here, and then I retest with a little wider, and then most, I take them wider and I actually get that another 20 degrees. That also is another clue that you should be squatting a little wider than shoulder width apart, and you should play with getting your toes out a little bit wider as well. Also, if you have an injury, I have a long history of sports injuries, and I got one hip that even on my stance, I'll have one foot a little bit more externally rotated because of an injury that I had to the hip. So even from side to side, we might be a little bit unique as well, and that's okay. Okay. All right, so this would be the anteverted hip. You'll see that this person, if they turn out, they're actually going to create, by turning out, they'll create a pinch, and they won't even, structurally, they won't be able to get there. But all of us fall in a little bit of in between that zone. Some will be on one extreme and the other as well. And clicking, popping in the hips, these are usually signs of some of these things as well. Whenever somebody does a lot and they get a lot of a click in that hip, especially if it's not pain. If it's a painful click, this is another discussion. It's usually labrum or cartilage in the joint. So are your knees stable? Does anybody see a problem with that? So the biggest cue that we want when we get into a bit of a squat stance, or even most of it, is to corkscrew the feet into the ground. Can everybody stand for a sec? We just try that. So imagine your foot is on a plate and it's turning out without moving at all. So when we do that, your kneecap should kind of turn outwards so that your knees are kind of rotating out. And if you put your hand on your butt muscles, your butt should turn on right away. That's how we activate the glutes, okay? So as we get into a squat position, we actually want those knees to kind of follow over the toes and come out as you come into that position. So we don't want the opposite, which is the knees diving in and caving in. That's what we call an unstable knee. When we want to corkscrew in, that's how we create stability in that knee throughout the movement. Very hard to hurt your knee if it's in a nice stable movement over. You can have a seat as well. So the tripod foot, if you haven't heard of the tripod foot, can you guys see this diagram? So imagine when you just did what you did, as you're seated, you can try it again, do a little corkscrew. The tendency so for most people that don't know how to corkscrew, they usually cave in and they are putting all their weight on their big toe and the inside of their heel. But when you learn to corkscrew, many people start putting all their weight on the outside of on their pinky and the outside of their foot, so they start doing something like this. We don't want that. We want to stretch the toes. That's why there's something to be said for doing some barefoot. I'm a big advocate of doing lots of barefoot stuff. I'll come to that in a sec. But especially you're squatting, you're deadlifting. Imagine you're stretching your toes out. So you got that big toe that's putting pressure, you got your pinky that's putting pressure, and you got your heel that's putting pressure. If you do that combined with a corkscrew, that's going to be a very, very stable foot. And that foot's going to prevent a lot of this. You'll see people as they're squatting, they're doing all this stuff with the knee. It's going all over the place. But if you corkscrew in, you'll be nice and firm, and you drive over the toes. We good? Oh, and then the drive the knees wide, that cue also is where we end up using a lot of the glute and the glute activation for that. Need a stable foot and arch to keep that knee aligned. So a pronated foot, so if this is my right foot, a pronated foot is somebody that kind of comes in with the knee. It's in line with kind of caving. If the knee caves in, that foot pronates in, okay? So that's a normal movement, but hyperpronation, when the ankle or foot drops in and the knee dives in, that's not what we want. The opposite is supination. When the foot kind of comes off, we don't want that either, okay? We want, the foot is supposed to heel strike, you're supposed to do a little bit of pronation, then you come off the toe. But when we're in a squat position, we want to make sure that tripod foot maintains. But we do need proper ankle mobility, and this is where the 5-inch test comes in. I don't know, do you think?
Take a volunteer.
Volunteer? Sammy? I don't think I've tested you. Have I tested you? So we should go shoes off. So you get one of these things. If anybody owns one of these fancy, really, really fancy things. 5 inches. All right. And then go to the put your toe at the 5-inch mark. All right, bend down. So essentially we want to keep the heel down, and you want to keep the heel down, and you want the knee to touch. Can you go forward a couple slides? Yeah, there you go. So can you guys see that's what Samantha's doing in that picture there? So you're bringing that knee forward. So there's a couple things that we note. What do you feel, Samantha? What are you doing? It's tight in the back? Okay, you're good. You're good. That's so essentially you're going to feel either a block sensation when you come up, you're going to feel a block sensation in the front, or you're going to feel tightness in the back, or your knee's going to dive in to try to achieve that, or your heel's going to come off the ground, then you can't achieve it, or you'll be off by like 2 inches. So you measure that, and then you do some of the stuff we talked about testing and retesting. Do some of the stuff that we'll talk about in a second. So depending on what you got, just like remember the hip joint, that bony little pinch in the front, same analogy, pinch in the front, it's usually a bone. So with that, we want to do banded. Anytime it's bone joint, banded distractions. A very important distinction for those of you that might be doing banded distractions already is that when you're using a heavy band, we don't want to put it across the shin bone. We want to put it over the malleoli, which are those two little bony processes of the ankle. We want to put it below that because there's a bone called the talus, which is the one that shifts forward, and that's one that's actually causing the pinch. Okay, so what we want to do is pull on that bone, and that creates space based on what we talked about earlier that allows that bone to move where it needs to move. So just for some people, just doing that alone, they test, retest, and they hit it right away, okay? And there's some soft tissue restrictions, which is when you have tension in the Achilles or in the back part. That's when we start using more of the soft tissue stuff, foam rolling. You can put your ankle on a kettlebell and do what we call poor man's ART, lacrosse ball, that type of thing as well. So for the joint restriction, again, the best way to do that is to banded mobilization, push that talus backwards. So imagine we're putting a band. Can you guys see this diagram? So see that little star? That's the ankle bone on the outside. We want it to be below that, okay? In order to do that well, we usually have to elevate the foot. We can't do it on a flat surface to get the best angle. Elevate that foot a little bit and then pull back on that. So I think having a heavy band, everybody should have a heavy band to work on these joints. At some point, you're going to have some restriction in your joints, so it would be advantageous to have that. So you could do, let's see, do we have a rep count there? That's okay. I can come back to that to give some recommendations.
Sure.
So soft tissue restrictions, this one is kind of the part that I like to talk quite a bit about. You'll see the shoes that I wear. Typically, 90% of the time I wear shoes with no heels or I'm barefoot. So what a lot of people that feel that they have tightness in their calf or in their hamstring or in their glutes or in their low back, most, I'd say 90% of the world, is wearing a shoe where the back part is high. We call that high heels, not like a lady's pump, but a high heel shoe. So what you're effectively doing is all the time you're chronically shortening up your whole backside. So in the world of weightlifting, for Olympic lifting, we actually use as an advantage because it gets us into a better position. And there is a time and a place for that. But for most of life, we should spend as much time as possible without heeled footwear, because that's going to allow that Achilles to stretch. So imagine 8 to 12 hours a day, you're shortening up the back of your foot by wearing something like this, and then you try to stretch it for 5 minutes, it's probably not going to be that effective. So the greater good would be to let that lengthen over time. I would warn you, if you've been wearing heeled footwear for a long time and all of a sudden you wear minimal shoes or you go barefoot or you decide to go do a marathon barefoot, you're going to probably destroy the tissues in your body. And there's something that we talked about earlier, which I like to talk about, which is tissue tolerance. So tissue tolerance, imagine somebody has knee pain and their tendon right here is sore. So if you have a thermometer and you strengthen your tissues and you work out like once a day, your thermometer, let's say it's 100 degrees maximum, you probably have like a load tolerance in that tissue of up to 80 degrees. And that day you decide to do 3 or 4 workouts or play basketball for 4 hours, and then your knee blows up and it gets swollen and inflamed, you've exceeded your tolerance for that tissue. But if you always work just below that tissue, that's how we kind of keep you. In order to increase your load, you strengthen more and you get stronger more and you do more. And that's how we slowly increase our tissue tolerance. And that's the difference between somebody that's really, really not able to do anything when they're 80 versus a person that's going for a hike, going to get all their groceries, traveling the world. Those are all the differences as well. You're increasing your tolerance in your tissue over time as well. So stretching your soles, Achilles. So a couple options for when you're stretching is one that we do at the gym here is where you actually come in and kind of hold that. You can also grab the table and put your body weight into it. You can put a weight on top of here like a kettlebell and stretch on that. If you've never done it, just be careful. But for those of you that have done some stretching, you actually loading that up actually is beneficial. Sitting in a goblet squat. So this would be a weighted goblet squat position. You can use a plate, a dumbbell, a kettlebell, anything, and you just sit with a bit of weight in that position. If you're new to squatting, I would caution all of this, but if you squat regularly, this is how we actually lengthen all that posterior tissue. If you want to make it more interesting, you can actually, instead of wearing high-heeled shoes, you go barefoot. If it's something you do already, you might want to actually put something in the front of your toes, and it creates actually more of a stretch as well. Just be careful as well if you've never done that. 2 minutes of foam roller. The goblet squat would be 4 to 5 reps, 10-second hold. Has anybody heard that static stretching affects your performance? This is something we actually do know that it does. So if you just sit and stretch your hamstrings and hold that for like 1 to 2 minutes, your performance actually reduces. But it depends on always what your goal is. So if you do like 10 to 20-second stretches, it won't necessarily affect. But if you're doing very long stretches, you might want to reserve that for after you've worked out as well. Okay. And then you retest. So the best thing to do is just keep retesting all the stuff that we kind of talked about. You just try some of the stuff we talked about, and then you retest as well. Okay. Toe spacers. So many of us, because of the shoes that we wear, your toes actually get very, very compressed. And if you have bunions or overlapping toes, we know genetically there is some links to that, but it's because everybody's wearing the same footwear as well. So even if the family, so when your toes are overlapping, your toes should have spacing very similar to your hands. You should have nice big spaces. You should have control over your toes, just like you should. We're doing this stuff. In the morning routine, there's a whole toe routine where you're using your big toe, you're using all your other toes as well, so that you gain control and you create space. Some of us, including myself, I used to do endurance training for years and years and years, wearing, you know, these high-heeled running shoes, compressing my toes. My toes were all overlapping too until I started wearing these things that are called toe spacers. We call them wild toes because it's kind of like rewilding, bringing your feet back to the way they should be. So that's something that we use a lacrosse ball as well once the toe spacers are in. I also recommend for people that are working on their feet to actually put toe spacers in and actually do some squatting, do some of the activities that we're talking about with the toes spread. Squat University is something that you might want to look into, and a lot of this information came from Squat University and a couple other guys that I follow that are pretty keen on how to get the body to move better. And all of them are advocates for getting your feet to get into a normal position, which is spacing out your toes is a big part of that.
For those of you who don't know, it's not a university, it's just an Instagram account. Anybody has access to it.
Squat, yeah, it's a website as well. Yeah. Foot Collective is also if you'd like to kind of get your feet into a better position. I think they have a 6-week free course that you can take to kind of get your feet back into a more natural position. Yeah, you can check them out. These toe spacers come from the Foot Collective. And what shoes you're in. So what are the best shoes? Well, it depends on what your goals are. For some people, like I said, in Olympic lifting, you actually might want a high heel because it gets you into a better position more safely and you can load up. But having a wide toe box, having a heel lift, not having a heel lift most of the time, having some malleability in the foot, having a shoe. What shoes do you have? What shoes do you have with you? Okay. All right. So what we want is a shoe to actually have some give and some mobility as well, and we don't want a big high heel. They're actually really, really hard to find unless you're actually looking for a shoe like this, or toe spacers as well. But being barefoot some of the day would be a good way to begin as well. So essentially, that's what a natural foot should look like. You put them in modern shoes, and then you have what we call a normal foot, which is toes scrunched, arch lost. The main point I was making with stable foot is when your toes are all overlapping like this, that makes you, because you don't have a good stable foot, remember I said you want to spread your toes, pinky, big toe, because your toes are compressed, that's why you end up pronating. Your actual foot ends up collapsing because it doesn't have a very stable surface to put pressure on. So squatting with some weight, there's a gentleman that I follow closely called Peter Attia. He's got this book that kind of is competing with ours now, I think. So
he might have sold a few more copies.
So he might have sold a couple more million copies. So the idea is, if in order to live a long and healthy life, you have to get some level of strength into you. And if you squat heavy safely, it's probably one of the more functional in terms of functional movements. Getting off that toilet, getting off the ground, doing all these things. The deadlift is important, but I just thought I'd spend the most time in probably the most important one. So just getting into a little bit of a squat. I have some exercise that I send on videos as well. We're going to pass this around if you want to pass it around. So there's a bunch of videos that I can send you if you'd like on some of the stuff that we talked about. But essentially, even if you're new to squatting, just grabbing a surface and bringing your body into that position and coming back up would be a great way to start. And then you start loading that, getting deeper safely. If there's any pain, that's a red flag that you probably want to talk to somebody or do a little investigation as well. So the hinge, it would be not correct for me to miss the hinge, because I think this is how I see a lot of back pain, of course, with what I do. So if I don't teach you how to hinge, I'd be really disappointed in myself. So if you guys all want to stand for 1 sec. So essentially, if we're moving around the hips and not the spine, whether you're picking up a penny off the floor or your grandchild or a sock, because I see people picking up a pen and a sock coming in with their back thrown out. So if we hinge, essentially what we're doing is we're initiating that movement with the tall chest and the glute back. And you're not allowing this part of your back to round. So if I don't start with the butt, now I'm going to round my back. If I start with my butt, now I'm going to round. And then you slightly bend your knees as needed. I don't have the flexibility to touch the floor with my hamstrings when I hinge, so there's a point at which where I have to bend my knees. And I don't do this to just pick up 400 pounds. I do that to pick up, I wish, but I'm almost there. But I do that to pick up my water bottle. So often you'll see somebody do a beautiful deadlift position where they lift all this tremendous weight and then they go get their water bottle and they kind of round out their whole spine. And then they're like, oh, my back, that water bottle, So hinging is important where you feel that tension in your hamstrings and you feel that in your glutes as you bring that bum back as well. And that's what we call a hip hinge. We use it for almost every movement in life, and it's important to initiate that movement as well. Okay, we're good. Air squat as well. Do you think we got it covered?
Covered it.
Yeah, I think we're good. An air squat essentially means an unweighted squat. So again, we want that stable foot, stable knee, corkscrew that foot into the ground. A butt wink and neutral spine. So has anybody heard of a butt wink? So a butt wink is the point at which when you're here and then you all of a sudden your butt goes in like this and then it comes back and then you lift up. It often happens in the world that we're in with lots of squatting and lifting, but people just picking stuff up too. So if we're in a natural position, we're definitely winking at the bottom of the squat, and that's okay because I don't have a lot of load on me. But if you put 200 pounds on my back and then I come back into that, essentially what we're potentially doing is we can potentially take the spine out of its neutral position, and that's when we start looking at damaging some of the structures in the spine. We have 24 movable bones in the spine, and in between each one of them we have a Tim Hortons jelly donut, a big disc that can bulge or herniate as well. If we get into a bad position or we lose neutral spine with weight, that's a perfect formula to herniate disc in your spine. Can you go forward? One. So when we limit ankle mobility also is a reason why we do this, because we don't have enough ankle mobility to get there. So this far one would be a flexed low back, which is the extension is where we're moving this way, flexion is where we're moving this way. So at that bottom, that person has lost now their neutral spine and is in this position as well. So you go forward one, yeah. So that you'll see that low back is rounded, and potentially the disc in the back bulges into those nerves as well. Let's go down one. And so I always use that analogy of a fluid-filled disc, and that bulges out. So if I put a Tim Hortons jelly donut on the ground, I step on it, what happens to the inside bulges out, and then it puts pressure directly on those nerves. And then some of you are quite maybe too intimately familiar with the sciatic nerve. So numbness, tingling, pain shooting potentially all the way into your toes, because that nerve controls your entire leg and the backside as well. So there's different workarounds that we have for that. One of them is to videotape yourself and actually see where you wink, and you might want to stop at that point. And then based on some of the hip mobility and some of the stuff we talked about, that's how you actually increase it. Ankle mobility, hip mobility is probably the most important thing to work on for that butt wink or avoiding the butt wink, especially with the weighted squat. Your thoracic spine mobility, there's 3 kind of standard ways to test this, but we can just do this right now. Take both hands, take them overhead. If you can get them kind of behind your ears, you passed. And if you can't, you got some work to do. If you're going way beyond, we probably want to work on your stability of your, because there is a risk of having unstable shoulders as well, where we can actually break down that cartilage and lose a bit of that stability. So you want to take both arms at the same time to do that. There's another one where you actually are 90 degrees and you're doing wall slides, where you put your arm against the wall. And there's another technique where you're laying on your back, imagine with a squat position, arms are laying on the ground, and then you straighten out the legs. If your arms kind of come off, that tells us it's okay. Those are all ways to screen that. Thoracic mobility, nice, cheap, easy, those $3. I'd be careful with lacrosse balls with thoracic spine. Some people, I see that they hurt their back using some of it, but even tennis balls. And you kind of put these in a sock, and then you kind of work between the little pointy bits down the center of your spine, which is your spinous process. And you put that, kind of those tennis balls all the way down. You can work a little bit of mobility down that. Foam rolling also works as well. Seeing somebody like myself, helps as well. Neutral spine, we kind of hit on this a few times, but the analogy I like to use, remember we did that little push that out? So I want you to practice taking big breaths in, big breath out, creating that tension in there. So just to understand, when you're folding over that spine and you're keeping that neutral spine position, whether it's 500 pounds or whether it's 5 pounds. So if I squeeze this water bottle and that lid's on, what are the chances that I can get through this thing? Pretty small. Take the lid off. So when I do this is essentially what I'm doing. I'm creating this tension and I'm holding that stable, rigid spine that potentially can never get hurt in that position, okay? As soon as I exhale or fold or don't stabilize my spine, I try to lift something with that. That's essentially like taking the lid off, then I can just crush that bottle. Just if you take that home, remember that one. And then this is one of the best things to do pre-workout. We used to do abs and core and stuff at the end of the workouts. You'll see that at every gym. People do cardio, they do their weights, and then they do their core. What we now know is you want to do your core exercises, turn on all those muscles that stabilize your spine, especially the big glute muscles. And the McGill 3 is probably the classic. I teach this. I have a video on this too. If you want that video as well, I can send that to you, where I kind of go through the big 3. There's 3 specific exercises that are well researched. They're good for rehab. They're good for preventing any sort of issue as well in the future. And I think everybody should do these before any significant lifts. It doesn't take much time at all. Often these exercises are in our pre-workout that we do here at the gym as well. How early can we lift? So strength and bone density, and we talked about this whole longevity lifespan discussion. So a lot of that has to do with how strong your muscles are and how strong your bones are. And if you're strong later on, your quality of life is going to be radically different than if you're weak and you have this sarcopenia, which is this age-related muscle loss. But we now know that it's kind of like an investment. The longer we invest with compound interest, the more we're going to have at the end. And that same analogy now is used for strength and resistance. So we now know that it's quite safe. We thought that growth was stunted in younger folk. As long as we are supervised and as long as we're doing things in a safe environment, as my kids start strength training as well. So at an early age, you can start strength training. It's never too early. We're learning now, as long as it's supervised, it's instructed, and it's in a safe environment. But again, and it's never too late. That's the other thing too. We know that as long as you're able to lift it and you're able to increase all the time a little bit more, we know that that is creating a lot of advantage for you later in life. And there's all these associations where at many points there's like many bodies, governing bodies that are now on board with lifting at a younger age. That's what we also know.
Cool. So I'm just going to talk through some of this stuff to put it in perspective, because it can be a little overwhelming, I guess, when you start picking some of this stuff up. So, and not that this is like copy and paste kind of intention, but this is just kind of what our habits look like. So for myself, in terms of mobility, I try to do a 20-minute mobility routine, and I use our 5-pillar kind of mobility method, shameless self-promotion. But basically, 20 minutes a day. I usually do them before workouts. My priority is isn't necessarily performance of the workout. So, and that kind of depends. Like, I'm not trying to be super recovered in between sessions. I just want to be able to get through session without any injury. And so if your priority is kind of joint stability, I find that works pretty well. So about 20 minutes of a mobility routine, usually before workouts. I'll pass it over to Dan to talk through some of his mobility kind of tactics.
So I often do a sauna in the morning. I'm a big advocate of sauna. I can send you a lot of research on that for longevity. The electrolyte I like to use, I always encourage, I think most people from a hydration standpoint, you need to be hydrated for your joints. You know, it's kind of like putting lots of hydration in your body and your joints. So hydration is important, but the true definition of hydration is water and electrolytes. So a lot of people just guzzle water and they don't have a good quality electrolyte. So that's why I use a product called Element that I tend to like. There's quite a few good ones. I would just stay away from all the artificial chemicals and sugars and that as well. Collagen gelatin is also, it'd be hard to have a talk on joints without mentioning that. There's some pretty good research if you have your collagen or gelatin like 30 to 60 minutes pre-workout before you're going to use the tissue that you want. So I have some issues in my knees and my hips. So I would be using some collagen and gelatin, and there's some studies that have shown that it actually goes to that tissue to rebuild and regenerate some of that tissue. So something you might want to look at. Daily cars, I try to do that cars after, and it takes me about 10 minutes. If I'm in a rush, I specifically at least focus on the areas where I've had some issues in the past. Spinal range of motion is another video that I use. So I tell people if you're brushing your teeth, you might as well go through all your ranges of motion of your spine. So that's your neck, your mid back, and your low back as well. Depending on what we do at the end of the day, some end of day joint specific stuff. So that could be some foam rolling, some lacrosse ball work, some kettlebell work as well. If we're watching some screen time, that would be a good time to do that. When you both get comfortable on the floor, try to get off that couch if you're able to do that. Pails and rails is strengthening. So the cars is one part of it. Pails and rails is progressive angular isometric load. So we're actually strengthening in our end range. So you can talk to me specifically about that. We use some of that too in the gym. Wearing toe spacers, I usually, if you're working on your feet, you want to wear them every day, and you start progressively wearing them longer. Once you're in a pretty good position, once or twice a week is what I wear them, as much as possible in the afternoon. And then part of my big mobility is mucking around with kids on the floor. I strongly encourage anybody that has kids or grandkids, get comfortable on the floor, play with them, do some of your core work while you're down there with them. They mimic you. They realize that this is what we do and this is how life is. So those are the main ones for me.
Then in terms of strength and conditioning, I walk the dog for 45 minutes a day. So that's like a little bit less than zone 2, but we found that zone 2, that's kind of a cardiovascular talk, but that's been heavily linked to longevity. Those blue zone people tend to do low level physical activity. So that's kind of what I get in daily. And then my workout schedule, I just go 3 days on, 1 day off. I've kind of tinkered with that a little bit. That tends to work best with my body. And I play basketball once a week. And that's it. That's my whole span for my workout, main mobility routine.
So I walk I try to walk. This is kind of my goals, by the way. I try to walk daily, 20, 30 minutes. Weighted vest. Now that the weather's nicer, it looks, when I can wear a coat over my weighted vest, it looks a little bit more socially accepted. So now in all seriousness, since I'm trying to get a rucksack now, I would look into rucking. If rucking just means hiking with load, so there are actual like nice packs you can get that you can put a plate in it and walk. So I would strongly recommend that. We know for longevity, for eccentric load, which is another one we didn't fail to talk about, for fall prevention, doing a very slow, because a lot of people step off a curb and that's when they fall, or off the toilet, these types of things as well. I'm in here, my goal is like 5 days a week, but 3 to 4 is more realistic. And then I do strength training at home as well. I got some weights there. And then the zone 2 cardio, whether it's on a bike or walking, so that weighted walk will take me, walk alone, my heart rate is not into the zone 2 that we briefly talked about. You'll probably keep hearing more about the zone 2 because some of the people that we are following are talking about it. So probably in about 5 years, it'll be very popular. Right now, it's becoming popular. And then, of course, you have to support, when you break down the body, you have to support it. So the protein requirements have changed pretty dramatically in the last few years. I'm going to leave you with, for every pound you weigh, you probably want to eat close to a gram of protein for that. And then a lot of the carb, I've been on like keto and different carb stuff where we're looking at different things in your diet. Now I'm actually starting with protein, and then I don't worry too much about the other stuff as long as my protein requirements are in. We're talking about bone strengthening. We're talking about muscle strengthening. This is where your protein requirements, we've realized, have to be at a good level for tomorrow, not for today.
A lot higher than the Canada Food Guide will tell you.
Much higher, yeah.
Cool. So I want to challenge you guys to take a little bit of action. Hopefully this isn't just a bunch of stuff that's going in one ear, out the other. So I want you guys to think about a habit. First of all, a habit that maybe you know is limiting kind of your prospective health span. So and that might be sitting too much. It might be smoking. It might be like arguing too much with a spouse or something, whatever it happens to be. Pick something you know is going to shorten your life and try to restrict that. And then choose a longevity habit that you want to develop. So that might be daily cars, might be daily mobility routine, maybe it's starting a gym routine, working with a trainer, whatever it happens to be. And over the next 60 days, I want you to commit to 5 to 10 minutes per day just on either doing these activities or planning for these activities and making them happen. Because ultimately, we can talk for days about what's going to help you live longer, but it's not going to happen once we put something in practice. And just to really hammer this home, to bet on yourself, I want you to share your plan with an accountability partner. So once you've figured out what you're going to do, your harmful habit, your good habit you're going to add in, find someone that will keep you accountable. Don't choose somebody that's going to let you off the hook. Someone might be somebody you don't know. You can meet somebody here, exchange numbers, whatever it happens to be. And then I want you to verbally agree to pay that partner $20 for every day that you don't do those 2 tasks. And I can guarantee, I did this once in my life and I absolutely nailed my goals. That's one of the few times it actually worked. So if you want this to like work in a foolproof way, challenge you guys to do that. Just some resources for you guys. So we talked through that, the mobility stuff. So we developed these routines that are based on those 5 pillars of mobility: release, open, lengthen. For our members here, it's included in your programming. For you that aren't members here, you can they're also available on YouTube. So you just look that up and they're just free routines. So we made them super easy. You just plug it in, just follow along. There's nice relaxing music and stuff like that. It's nice to like wind down activity towards the end of the day. I also have Healthspan Academy podcast, which Dan's been on a couple times. So we talked through, we just kind of had a bunch of like experts in the field, some professors, some kind of pro athletes, a mix of people kind of that are really good at certain components of how we know we live longer. And then fitness wise, if you're looking for a gym, we're in one. It's called Royal City Fitness. You can check us out at royalcityfitness.com. Our remote stuff is 5pillarmethod.com. And then Dan can obviously reach out at guelphnaturalhealth.ca. And did we have a sign-up sheet? Is that going around for?
Was there a sign-up sheet out there? Yep,
okay,
perfect.
cool. Yeah, so we're just pre-order. You're able to pre-order copies of our book. We did run out of, I don't know how this sold out. I think we have more family than we thought we realized. But if anyone is interested in ordering a book, let us know and we can get a hard copy order for you. And that's all we got, guys. Thanks so much for being here, and we'll take a minute if everyone wants to hang around for questions or to chat, and we'll kind of go from there. Cheers, guys.